In this presentation, you're going to get a step-by-step guide on creating a remote internal audit schedule. Hello and welcome to our ongoing series of compliance and business improvement presentations presented by Mango. My name's Craig Thornton and I present these sessions on all things to do with compliance.
In conducting remote audit, yes, in any audit, we need to understand obviously our audit criteria or requirements, essentially the procedures or the audit requirements we're auditing against on the particular day of the audit. So if I'm going out to a warehouse to do quality audit on packing and dispatch processes, or perhaps going out to a construction company to audit working at heights procedure, we need to understand those criteria, work our way. If we were running a normal audit course for a normal audit, not a remote audit, I would say, I would advocate really understand the criteria, start to, read through it carefully, where are records, and so what's going to be your sources of evidence against the different requirements in that procedure. So where are records or documents required? Where would it be better to interview people or make observations to gather the audit evidence we need? With those three elements, records, documents, interviews, observations being our primary evidence sources. Now, step number one in any remote audit, that kind of pre-planning, really understanding your criteria and where you'll be able to source objective evidence is more important than ever, because, Craig's the warehouse team leader for that quality audit I mentioned. In a real audit where we can do it face-to-face, there's a bit more contingency. If Craig's not available, I might be able to interview the warehouse manager instead, something like that, or one of the warehouse staff. Obviously, in remote audits, that it's not as immediately easy to come up with a backup solution if we haven't thought about that ahead of time. So you can see in the second and third columns, we did touch on this last time, you do need to identify what remote audit tools and software you're going to use. We did advocate that you actually test them with the nominated auditees ahead of time. Even as we've got in the third column, have a backup there. So the first line it's saying, well, if I'm going out to the warehouse to audit Craig, if this is a remote audit now, we've decided to use Microsoft Teams and I'll get Craig to screen share things. Hang on, if that doesn't work on the day for whatever reason, well, I'll get him to email me some of the records after the audit. That's from experience doing a lot of remote audits at the moment. Yes, you need some kind of backup tool as well, and you need to test that as well. Other elements there, some backup, some contingency. Even you can see where under the interview as our source of evidence, that's where I put a little note. Even have a contingency or backup person there. I want to interview Craig, but if he's not there for whatever reason, then who's going to be the backup person? And obviously the big situation with COVID-19 is, step number one, is the warehouse actually open, or is that construction site actually open? Number two, if the people we want to interview, well, are they working from home? What's their current work arrangements as well? Last thing I would say about those kind of software tools, yes, as an auditor or for other internal auditors you have in your business, worthwhile doing some training or getting some familiarity around the tools as well, because if in the second column there, I've got the primary, going to use Microsoft Teams there to both interview the auditee and look at records. Well, there's those typical web conferencing issues that come up. What if my audio is not working? What if Craig's audio is not working? What if the screen share is not working? Well, you've got to know how to get those things back online pretty quickly, or divert to your backup option pretty quickly. Otherwise, I've laboured that a little bit, but that if we have any kind of breakdowns in use of the tool at either end, your audit can be over pretty quickly, unfortunately. Okay, obviously one other little piece of contingency there. Yes, I've lined up Craig to interview him using Microsoft Teams. With any of that web conferencing software, there can be that issue where, Craig can see me, I can see him, but for whatever reason we can't hear each other. So yeah, have some phone backup so you can talk to that person and work out how you're going to resolve that kind of software issue or connection issue, whatever it might be. Particularly the last row, observation, can be a really important source of objective evidence. I did do an audit recently in a manufacturing facility, and that's where your prior planning really comes into account. That was a safety audit. So number one, what plant and equipment do they have? What mobile plant equipment? What chemicals? In that particular example, I knew ahead of time that they had an overhead crane. So they took me around via FaceTime, I think it was, and rather than me not being aware that was there, I already had some questions I wanted to ask. It was an interview and observation at the same time. You know, the questions I wanted to ask the operators, and already knew some of the records I wanted to see because of that prior planning and preparation. As I said, in any audit that's important. In a remote audit, more so. You know, you've got to have. If it's the first time when they take me around on FaceTime, if that's the first time I get to see any of the hazards in the workplace, then there's too much of a chance that I'll miss something. So understand those hazards before you get there. Continuing just that refresher around conducting remote audits, we did say in that previous webinar that in any audit, a key success factor is managing people successfully. You know, auditees are intimidated or threatened by the process, are not going to offer much information during the audit process. So managing people, reinforcing what the audit objective is about. It's not about the system or finding fault with what they're doing. Can be really important in any audit, but more so obviously in a remote audit, because in a live audit situation you have the additional advantage. You can read the body language, some of the non-verbal communication that might indicate that someone's really uncomfortable with how the audit's happening. That's obviously a lot harder to pick up via remote technology means. So yes, even prior to the audit, reinforce that we're not out there to find fault with people. Some of those little things we may be a bit more flexible within an internal audit, normally like a opening meeting where we have a chance to explain and reinforce what it's all about. Again, personally, you know, you might be a bit flexible about whether you need that opening meeting in a normal internal audit. At the current time, if you're going to do a remote audit, I would strongly advocate you have those formal things like an opening meeting, just so you get that chance to ask if there's any concerns and reinforce what it's really all about. The other little element there, I've got just an example of a very basic kind of audit schedule. In terms of planning and logistics communication, I've got another slide on that, but suffice to say at the moment, if I've got an audit, let's say it's in that at a construction site, one of our construction sites for a construction company as an example, we're going to cover hazard and risk identification in September, management of change and document management. If that's something, you know, normal operations, business as usual, if I knew the auditees know that audit's in September, I could probably just contact them at the end of August, early September to say, hey, site contact person, you know, you're aware the audit's happening and you're comfortable if I come out on a certain date in September. What I would advocate is bring that planning forward. You know, confirm the audit earlier. I'd start right now, start a confirmation, you're aware we're coming, here's what we need to cover, here's the tools we're going to use, what are going to be the sources of evidence, what are the hazards on site, educate yourself about that. You know, right now, don't leave that to 2 or 3 days before the audit. Even just because there is more to manage in a remote audit and there's less that you can see. So even these audits in November, personally, I'd start to plan. If that was an internal audit in November at one of our other construction sites, I'd start to plan and prepare for that, understand your criteria, things like that right now, rather than, you know, 2 or 3 days out. Okay, so we're going to have to probably lift our game a little bit as auditors in terms of our understanding of the criteria, being proactive about managing the people and confirming the audit and the audit methods. Okay. Moving on a little bit, just a refresher around audit scheduling. So number one, if you do any kind of lead audit or training with any provider, or if you look at, there is a ISO standard there, ISO 19011, which is around essentially auditing principles and practices, and they will always advocate, yes, you need a clear, if this is a service, you know, if we're for any type of business, I mentioned construction, manufacturing, a warehouse, if we provide services, whatever we do, we need to be very clear on it, pardon me, the objective and the scope of our whole audit program. And not just talking about one audit now, but by objective, why are we, let's say it's a safety audit program, why are we implementing a safety audit program? What are we aiming to achieve? That becomes very important as we review the progress of our program over time and try and evaluate whether it's been effective in achieving the objective. But obviously by scope of the audit program, that means what's the extent of it? Are we covering all the sites in our business, or is it just the New South Wales sites, for example, or is it just head office, the main site? What, you know, that's what they mean. The scope is really the boundaries around your audit program. So yes, whether it's remote audits that we want to schedule or on-site audits, we need to be very aware of both of those things. Just probably even more so around remote audits. Again, if you do any of those kind of lead auditor training, they'll say risk, assessing areas of risk within your business is a great way of prioritising your available internal audit resources. I haven't been to a business yet where the boss has agreed to endless auditing budget and you can do as many audits as you want. There's always an upper limit at our, if it's a construction business, maybe we can do, we've got budgets to do 20 site audits across a year. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to get the best return on investment for that? Risk can be formally, you know, not necessarily doing a formal risk assessment, but identifying across those different sites and the different activities we perform on site, what is high risk? Yes, that's a good way to prioritise resource use. We'll do more auditing and we'll target the higher risk areas more often. Same principle and same kind of concept applies to remote audits as well. The term problem areas is obviously framed a little bit negatively, but yes, if our systems, quality, safety, environment, food safety, they should be generating performance data. And yes, to get the best return on investment, it's worthwhile when we're putting together our audit schedule, remote or on-site, is to look at performance across the business. So if we are that manufacturing business and we've had more near incidents and near misses and incidents in the warehouse, well, obviously that's something that should be audited a little bit more frequently. Again, in any of those lead auditor courses, they'll talk about timing, and you could almost summarise it by that last dot point there is to conduct, you know, we want to be able to interview, we want to be able to observe, make observations, obviously look at documents and records. So the best time to do the audit is when that activity or process or task, whoops, sorry folks, if I go back a step, when that activity is actually occurring. So some of the considerations, shift patterns. Yes, I've been to businesses where when you analyse their audit schedule, hang on, 95% plus of it's just looking at the day shift. There's safety risks in the night shift as well, obviously, as well as seasonal patterns. There is, you know, we've got customers in the wine industry. Yes, vintage is very, very busy. That might be a time you avoid. Conversely, depending on the objective of your audit, it might be a time you specifically target to do an audit, given that that's when there can be an increase in safety or quality or other risks. Without going too far off today's topic, you know, yes, an audit when a team are extremely busy, it's the peak season for them. You might be doing more observation and looking at records rather than expecting to be able to interview everyone, but there can still be, depending on our audit objective, good reasons for doing it, even when teams are busy. Projects and irregular tasks, that's really just saying, yes, a construction project, for example, things happen at very discrete times. So if I want to audit some design-related processes and procedures, on the big construction projects for the tier 1 companies around town, I mean, design happens, starts and stops in a certain period of time. If I want to audit it after it's stopped, I mean, the whole team's generally moved on. All the best I'll be able to do is look at project files And that takes away that ability to interview and observe. That's the point there. Even with, I do see audit schedules where, you know, all the regular tasks are covered. Bulk chemical delivery, though, is a good example of an irregular task where the risk can often be a lot higher for some of those low likelihood activities. And if that's the case, then we should consider them. Let's find out from the operations manager when the next delivery is due, and let's do the audit when it's occurring. We'll get a higher value, more effective audit. Now, yes, timing is going to be a really big consideration and take more planning and coordination in a remote audit situation, touching base with the site manager to really get down to the level of, yeah, when is this activity going to occur? Is there going to be particularly a means, whether it's FaceTime, WhatsApp, or any of those other means to actually observe what's happening? If you can do that, that is really good. They're really important, as well as being able to interview people. The video side, in my experience of, or having some means of observing, I know I made the point before, in some of the remote audits I've done, hasn't worked so well, but when you really understand the site and the hazards there and the key things you want to focus on, and you direct the person with the camera to really make sure they spend some time looking, taking you down to observe those elements, it can work very, you know, that's where you'll get a much better outcome. But you must know what you want to target. Target's probably not the best word, what you want to focus on, rather than just a kind of a random walk around via video. Doesn't work so well. Now, in terms of, coming back to focus on scheduling of remote audits, which is our real focus today. Yes, there's some risks in the process. There's some things that are more difficult to achieve compared to an on-site audit, but there's also some, you know, significant opportunities. Number one, obviously every business we're facing different restrictions around COVID-19, but remote audit methods obviously allow us to continue our audit program and some of our other elements of our compliance program. The reality is, yes, if we're externally certified, certification bodies are not saying it's okay to put your systems on hold for 6 months and you'll still pass your audit. You're still going to need to demonstrate what you're doing. Regulators still expect you to provide a safe work environment, protect the environment, etc., etc., etc. You know, we can't, it's been fairly obvious observation perhaps coming out of COVID-19 is, yeah, we can't just put our compliance programs on hold. We have to keep them going. The other, what I'm trying to demonstrate with the fairly simple audit schedule down the bottom there too, is if, you know, you often see this kind of audit schedule for one particular site, a manufacturing business, for example, and the opportunity is that via remote, given we've got a limited budget, remote audit methods may allow us to visit and audit more sites than we otherwise would within that budget. Personally, what I'm finding is more and more of the auditees are very comfortable with the remote audit tools now compared to, say, 3 or 4 years ago, and have adapted to that very quickly. So this is just very simple visual representation down the bottom. Yes, here's an audit plan focusing on one site where across our safety and environment procedures as one example, we've just kind of broken up when we want to do these different audits in green. Now, where we can get more bang for our buck is via remote audits, is not saying we never want to in the future audit on site, but if we say, as an example, I've seen companies saying, well, we're going to audit 2 sites, so the depot and site 1, we're going to do on site this year, but we're going to get all these other sites we couldn't cover, another 5 or 6 sites, so another 5 sites there we're going to do remotely, just to increase the number of sites we can cover within our audit resources. And it might be that in 2022 we do site 2 and 3 on site, and then we do the other 6 sites, including the depot, remotely. And you can, but you know, that's particularly important for organisations. So for a utility company, a water company, a gas company, things like that, they tend to have sites all over the countryside, multiple sites, getting up to the 100+ sites, very geographically dispersed. So yes, there is going to be real opportunities and real value in putting together a if we've got an effective audit schedule that includes quite a number of remote audits, they can really increase their coverage of the number of sites they cover. Without, as an example, in my past, I've done some audits with West Australian Water Corporation. West Australia is a huge landmass. They've got hundreds and hundreds of sites in their internal audit schedule. If they were going to visit every site, it would take them 50 years to try and get there. I'm being a little bit, maybe not that long, but it's would be a huge challenge. This kind of remote auditing approach is really opening up more regular visitation to some of these sites, which is excellent. Some of the other remote audit scheduling considerations. Number one, I've touched on auditing. Yes, their availability. That's one thing I would confirm. Spend more time confirming. Are you actually going to be available, Craig? 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 5th or whatever the date is. Really confirm that, as well as don't just make assumptions because the warehouse is open that it means every warehouse staff member will actually be working there. Obviously, there can be other restrictions, or some people are just working from home. Other considerations in our audit program, probably touched on the second one there a little bit too. Yes, if we are increasingly using remote audit methods, do we need a little bit more, perhaps even some formal training around those methods or the tools with our internal audit team? Do we need to amend our audit procedure? We certainly should be considering what are the implications for information security, particularly if we're extending our audit program, remote audit program out to perhaps suppliers and subcontractors. The fact we're using kind of online technologies, how does that affect the information security arrangements? Another consideration, do we need to adopt and adapt any of our audit checklists? Even our audit report templates, I haven't added in there, but we should add in there. It should be very clear to, if I conducted that audit on the warehouse I've been talking about, it should be very clear to the readers after that audit how this audit was conducted, what technologies were used. Is maybe something you need to add to your audit report templates, because that's really important that the reader can understand it was a remote audit and how it was done. By sample size, that's just a prompt to really say, we've talked about our sources of evidence in any audit. Looking at documents, particularly records, are critical. They show the history, interviewing people, making observations. There's always that question in on-site audits of how much evidence is enough. Do I need to look at all 4 of those sources of evidence? Okay, if records are applicable to this particular requirement I'm trying to audit, well, how many records do I need to look at? And the prompt there is really to say, even on an on-site audit, that just really takes auditor judgment. There's no kind of simple statistical approaches to apply to that. Let's stick with a simple example. If it's a construction site and I'm auditing safety induction processes, what I'm trying to get to at this point is I tend to be more conservative in a remote audit than I do in an on-site audit. And that means, if I would normally ask for, let's say there's 50 people on site, and I would normally say, well, maybe I need to see 10 or 15 induction records. I would tend to just, by conservative, I mean increase that a little bit, make it 20 or 15, 20, 25, something like that, just because your other sources of evidence, observation, interview can be a little bit harder to achieve. It's a little bit harder to ask follow-up questions because you're not right there with people. So yeah, if I on the same audit wanted to interview 2 to 3 operational staff, I might increase that to 5 operational staff, just to give yourself, every audit's a sampling process. You don't detect every non-conformance that is there. You just, by increasing your sample size, you're just, you're increasing obviously the likelihood you would detect something, but it's also allowing you to cope with the fact that remote audit methodologies do have some limitations. I think the very last dot point there, and is really important as well. We said any audit program within your business internal audit program, you've got to have a clear objective, but we also need to review the audits we're conducting and what they're finding to work out whether the audit program has been effective in achieving that objective. So if we had a very broad one, say our safety audit program, our broad objective is to make sure teams are aware of the safe work procedures and we're providing a safe workplace. Well, we need to review the audit outcomes at different times across the year to make sure, is the audit program allowing us to evaluate that objective and achieve that objective. I.e., we don't just keep rolling on with the same audit program year after year. And if the answer is perhaps no, then you have that opportunity to adjust it. One little option there is, yes, an audit won't detect 100% of issues that occur, but across a whole audit program, following that safety audit program example, across the program, what kind of issues are you finding, and is there any kind of correlation with other safety performance data, i.e. if we've had a real trend of certain near misses and incidents in the warehouse, it's not going to be picked up in every audit, the underlying issues, but have certain issues been picked up around the safety system within the warehouse across the whole year in the audit program, is the kind of question we need to ask ourselves with that example. I think this is the final slide, and then we'll go to some questions. It's really just coming back to the planning and communication. I keep it fairly short, but if here's our audit plan down the bottom for a particular audit we want to do, we've got the people on the right-hand side, the auditees we want to speak to. That's really where I said, if normally, you might confirm with the auditees maybe a week ahead for an on-site audit. Is everyone available? Are we all aware of the audit? Are you all going to be available at the right times? That's the kind of thing I was suggesting before. Bring that forward. Start that as that kind of planning and confirmation of what's going to happen on the day and when people need to be available is what I mean by confirmation. Start that as early as possible, because in practice what you're finding is there's a little bit more, okay, we needed the project engineer here, but because that person's not on site because of the current situation, well, what are we going to do about it? The earlier you detect that, the more chance you've got to do something about it and come up with an alternative. The second point I won't reiterate too much. Yes, also have that phone contact in case everything fails, so you can still talk to them. An audit plan, this kind of audit plan you see down the bottom. Again, I did mention earlier some of the audit steps, like confirming the audit, having an audit entry meeting, some of the things that might sound a bit too formal in a normal internal audit. I'd suggest just for the moment, particularly with a remote audit approach, formalise those, and a bit of an audit plan showing the auditees what you want to cover, when exactly you need them. Things like that is more important than perhaps an on-site audit as well. Because an on-site audit, you can make those kind of adjustments pretty quickly. Project engineer's not here, what can we do about it? Much harder to make adjustments in a remote audit. Okay, so yeah, this typical kind of audit plan, more important than ever, as well as thinking about our required sources of evidence. Even that question of, okay, we've planned out a remote audit, but we know the sources of evidence and who we need and who we need to talk to, but if it's not really possible to get those sources of evidence or achieve our audit objective, yes, there can be times where you might need to say, well, for this particular audit objective, it's just not going to be viable, or because people are not available, it's just not going to be viable via a remote audit means at the current time or when it's planned. Okay. So whether that's something you want to put later in your audit schedule for when you can get on site, or whether there's some way of dealing with that. But yeah, let's not plan an audit for this, for next Wednesday at 9 o'clock if it's just not going to be viable via a remote audit methodology right at the moment.
If you enjoyed that video, why don't you click here to view how to conduct a remote internal audit.